The sound of hammers echoing through the morning air struck Margaret like physical blows, each one driving home the reality of what was happening to her life. She stood on the porch of what had been her home for 3 years, watching strangers nail boards across windows that had once framed her view of the herb garden she had planted with such care. The Whitmore family crest gleamed mockingly from the side of their wagon as Henry's relatives loaded her belongings, what few they deemed worthless enough to leave her, with the methodical efficiency of people accustomed to claiming what they believed was rightfully theirs. "Mrs. Whitmore," Augustus Whitmore III called out, his voice carrying the particular brand of condescension reserved for inconvenient relatives by marriage, "we'll need the house keys before we depart." Margaret's fingers tightened around the iron keys in her pocket, warm from her palm and worn smooth by daily use. 3 years ago, Henry had placed these same keys in her hand with such tenderness, telling her that she was finally home, that she would never want for anything again. Now his uncle stood before her like a creditor come to collect, his expensive suit and gold watch chain a stark contrast to the simple black dress Margaret had worn every day since Henry's funeral 2 weeks ago. "I understood that Henry's will," Margaret began, but Augustus cut her off with a wave of his manicured hand. "My dear woman, surely you cannot have believed that a brief marriage to my nephew entitled you to a permanent claim on Whitmore property." His laugh was as cold as the October wind that rattled the bare branches overhead. The house, the land, the business, all of it belonged to the Whitmore family long before Henry's unfortunate infatuation. And all of it remains with the family now that he's gone. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, despite the autumn chill. Infatuation. As if her marriage to Henry had been some passing fancy, rather than the deep love that had sustained them through 3 years of happiness, and 1 terrible month of watching consumption slowly steal his breath away. "Henry told me—" She tried again. "Henry told you many things, I'm sure," interrupted Cordelia Whitmore, Augustus's wife, her voice sharp as the November frost. "Young men in love are notoriously poor judges of legal realities. The fact remains that you have no legitimate claim on property that has been in our family for 2 generations. Margaret knew they were lying. She had seen Henry's will, had watched him sign it with the lawyer as witness, had heard him explain how everything would pass to her as his wife. But the will itself had mysteriously disappeared from Henry's papers, and the lawyer, coincidentally a long-time friend of the Whitmore family, now claimed to have no memory of any such document. "Where am I supposed to go?" Margaret asked, hating the tremor she heard in her own voice. "That, my dear, is hardly our concern," Augustus replied, consulting his pocket watch with elaborate disinterest. "Perhaps you have family who can take you in, or skills that might secure you employment. I understand there are positions available for women of reduced circumstances in the larger cities." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Margaret knew exactly what kind of positions Augustus was implying, and the fact that he would suggest such a thing to his nephew's widow told her everything she needed to know about his opinion of her worth. She handed over the keys without another word, watching as Augustus pocketed them, with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully completed a distasteful but necessary task. As the Whitmore wagon rolled away down the tree-lined drive, Margaret stood alone on the porch with a single carpet-bag containing her few remaining possessions, and absolutely no idea what came next. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was once again homeless and alone, just as she had been before Henry found her working as a seamstress in Mrs. Patterson's dress shop. She had been 19 then, orphaned and struggling to make ends meet on the pittance that needlework provided. Henry had come in to order a dress for his sister's birthday, and had somehow ended up spending an hour talking to Margaret about books, music, and the dreams they both harbored for lives larger than their current circumstances allowed. Their courtship had been brief but intense, filled with long walks and longer conversations about everything from poetry to politics. Henry had been unlike any man Margaret had ever met. Educated but not condescending, wealthy but not arrogant, passionate about justice and fairness in ways that made her believe the world could be better than it was. When he proposed after only 3 months, Margaret had said yes without hesitation, certain that she had found not just love, but partnership with someone who saw her as an equal. The 3 years of their marriage had been the happiest of Margaret's life. Henry had encouraged her to continue her needlework, not from necessity, but because she enjoyed the creative challenge of transforming fabric into beauty. He had bought her books, taken her to concerts, included her in conversations with his friends, as if her opinions mattered as much as any man's. Most importantly, He had made her feel safe in a world that offered precious little security to women without family or fortune. Now standing on the empty porch with nowhere to go and less than $10 to her name, Margaret felt that security crumbling like autumn leaves beneath her feet. She spent that first night in the church, curled up in a back pew with her carpet bag as a pillow and her shawl as a blanket. Pastor Williams had offered her a meal and a night's shelter without asking questions, but Margaret knew she couldn't impose on the church's charity indefinitely. She needed work, and she needed it quickly. The next morning, she made her way back to Mrs. Patterson's dress shop, hoping against hope that her former employer might have work available. Mrs. Patterson was sympathetic but firm. Business was slow, and she already had more seamstresses than she could keep busy. The other shops in town told similar stories, and Margaret began to understand that her reputation as Henry's widow might actually be working against her. People who had once treated her with deference now seemed to view her as an uncomfortable reminder of how quickly fortune could change. By the end of her first week of freedom, Margaret had exhausted most of her options in town. She was sitting on a bench in the town square, trying to decide whether to use her last few dollars for another night at the boarding house or save the money for food, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. The rider who dismounted in front of the general store was so familiar that Margaret's heart nearly stopped. For one impossible moment she thought Henry had somehow returned from the grave, the same height, the same build, the same dark hair and strong jawline. But as the man turned and she got a clear look at his face, Margaret realized her mistake. This wasn't Henry risen from the dead, but someone who looked exactly like him. The stranger secured his horse and stood for a moment looking around the town square with the careful attention of someone taking measure of a new place. His clothes were dusty from travel, and there was something in his posture, a wariness, perhaps, or a readiness for trouble, that Henry had never possessed. When his gaze fell on Margaret, she saw his eyes widen with the same shock of recognition she had felt. He approached her slowly, as if he were afraid she might bolt like a spooked deer. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the same timbre as Henry's, but with a rougher edge. "But you wouldn't happen to be Margaret Whitmore, would you?" Margaret stared at him, speechless. Up close the resemblance was even more striking, though there were differences if you knew to look for them. This man's face was more weathered, marked by sun and wind in ways that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His hands were calloused, and there was a small scar above his left eyebrow that Henry had never had, but the eyes were the same deep brown, and the way he tilted his head when listening was achingly familiar. "How do you know my name?" she managed finally. "Because," the stranger said gently, "I'm Henry's brother, his twin brother, and I've been looking for you." Margaret felt the world tilt around her. "That's impossible. Henry never mentioned a brother. He said he was an only child." The man's expression grew grim. "Henry thought I was dead. Hell, I thought he was dead until 3 days ago when I rode through Cedar Creek and heard someone talking about the Whitmore funeral." He paused, studying her face with obvious concern. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Whitmore. I know this must be confusing, but we need to talk." Margaret looked around the town square, suddenly aware of the curious glances they were attracting. A stranger who looked exactly like the recently deceased Henry Whitmore was bound to cause talk, and she wasn't sure she was ready for the complications that kind of attention might bring. "There's a cafe on Elm Street," she said quietly. "It's usually empty this time of day." The stranger, who still hadn't given her his name, nodded and offered her his arm with the same courtly gesture Henry had always used. As they walked through town, Margaret found herself stealing glances at his profile, marveling at how someone could look so much like Henry while feeling so completely different. The cafe was indeed nearly empty, with only the owner behind the counter and an elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner. Margaret's companion chose a table in the back, positioning himself so he could see the door, another difference from Henry, who had never felt the need to monitor his surroundings for potential threats. "My name is James," he said once they were seated. "James Whitmore, though I haven't used that name in 15 years. 15 years? Margaret tried to process the timeline. "But Henry said I was dead because that's what our family told him," James interrupted, his voice carrying a bitterness that made Margaret flinch. "The same family that I'm guessing just threw you out of your home with nothing but the clothes on your back." Margaret stared at him. "How did you know?" James laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Because that's what the Whitmores do. They take what they want and dispose of whatever they consider inconvenient. They did it to me when I was 17, and apparently they've done it to you now. What happened when you were 17? James was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if seeking warmth. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. I fell in love with someone they didn't approve of. Maria Santos, the daughter of one of our ranch hands. She was beautiful and kind, and everything I thought I wanted in a wife. When I told our father I intended to marry her, he had her family thrown off our land and threatened with worse if they ever came back. Margaret felt her heart clench with sympathy. She could imagine Henry in a similar situation, standing up to family pressure for love. I told him I'd leave too, find Maria and marry her anyway, James continued. So, he had me arrested on trumped-up charges of cattle theft. I spent 6 months in jail while he spread word that I had died in prison. When I finally got out, Maria was gone, married to someone else who could actually protect her, and everyone I'd ever known believed I was dead, including Henry. I couldn't go back without putting Maria and her new family in danger, so I disappeared. Took a new name, headed west, made a life as far from the Whitmore name as I could get. Margaret tried to imagine the pain of losing not just the woman you loved, but your entire identity, your family, your very existence in the world you'd known. Why didn't you ever try to contact Henry? Let him know you were alive? James's expression softened slightly. I thought about it. God knows I thought about it. But what was I supposed to say? That everything he'd been told about his brother was a lie? That our father was capable of having his own son arrested to prevent an inconvenient marriage? I figured he was better off believing I was dead than learning the truth about what our family really was. Margaret felt pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed clicking into place. Henry's occasional mentions of feeling alone in the world despite his family's wealth, his passionate advocacy for workers' rights and fair treatment of employees, his insistence that love mattered more than social status when he married her, despite his family's obvious disapproval. He knew, she said suddenly. Maybe not the details, but some part of him knew what they were capable of. James nodded grimly. Smart man, my brother. I always knew he had more sense than the rest of them combined. His expression grew serious. Which brings me to why I've been looking for you. Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret. They had no right to take your home or your inheritance, none at all. Margaret felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. Tell that to Augustus and his lawyers. According to them, Henry's will mysteriously disappeared, and without it, I have no claim to anything. That's where they made their mistake, James said, his eyes gleaming with something that might have been anticipation. You see, there's something they don't know. Something Henry probably didn't even know, though I suspect he might have figured it out eventually. What? James reached into his coat and withdrew a worn leather portfolio, setting it carefully on the table between them. Our grandfather, Augustus's father, left a very specific will when he died, one that included provisions for protecting family members from internal disputes. Margaret stared at the portfolio. I don't understand. Our grandfather was a smart man who had dealt with his share of family scheming over the years. He set up the inheritance in such a way that if any direct Whitmore heir died leaving a widow, that widow automatically inherited not just her husband's share, but his voting rights in all family business matters. James smiled grimly. He wanted to make sure that women married into the family couldn't be simply discarded when their husbands died. Margaret felt her heart start to race. But they said a lot of things, and none of them were true. The lawyers they've been using are in their pocket, but the original will is on file with the county clerk. I checked before I came looking for you. Margaret stared at him, hardly daring to hope. Are you saying? I'm saying that according to the legal documents that actually matter, you own 51% of the Whitmore estate. The house, the businesses, the land, all of it. James leaned forward, his expression intense. They can't throw you out of your own home, Margaret, and they definitely can't steal your inheritance. The coffee cup slipped from Margaret's nerveless fingers, clattering against the saucer. That's impossible. If that were true, why wouldn't Henry have known? Because our dear Uncle Augustus has been managing the family's legal affairs for years, and he had every reason to keep certain information to himself. Information that would limit his control over family assets. James's smile was sharp as a blade. But see, here's the thing about family lawyers. They're loyal to whoever pays them best, and the lawyers who handled grandfather's original will, they're not the same ones Augustus uses now. Margaret felt dizzy with the implications. So what you're telling me is... What I'm telling you is that the Whitmores have been running a very successful confidence game, and you're about to call their bluff. James sat back in his chair, looking satisfied. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Margaret thought of the past week, sleeping in pews and doorways, begging for work, watching her meager savings dwindle to nothing while Henry's family celebrated their successful theft of her life. Then she thought of Henry himself, of the man who had loved justice and fairness above all else, and what he would want her to do. "I want them to face consequences for what they've done," she said quietly. "Not just to me, but to you, to Maria, to everyone they've hurt over the years." James nodded approvingly. "Good, because I've been planning this for 15 years, and I could use a partner who has a legitimate claim to what they've stolen." Over the next hour, James outlined a plan that was both elegant and devastating in its simplicity. Using the original will and other documents he had spent years collecting, they would force Augustus and his lawyers to acknowledge Margaret's true inheritance. But more than that, they would use her newfound legal authority to investigate the family's business practices, potentially uncovering decades of questionable dealings. "There's something else," James said as they prepared to leave the cafe. "Something I think you should know before you decide whether you trust me enough to go through with this." Margaret waited, noting the way his expression had become more serious. "I'm not doing this entirely for justice," he admitted. "I'm doing it partly for revenge. These people destroyed my life, made me disappear so completely that my own twin brother thought I was dead. I want them to pay for that." Margaret considered his words carefully. "And you think that makes you untrustworthy?" "I think it makes my motives complicated." Margaret stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that no longer trembled. "James, 3 days ago, I was living in what I thought was my home, mourning my husband and trying to figure out how to build a life without him. Today, I'm homeless and penniless because his family decided I was inconvenient. If you want revenge, then we have that in common." James smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she had seen from him. "In that case, Mrs. Whitmore, I think we're going to work very well together." The next morning, Margaret walked up the tree-lined drive to what had been her home, James beside her, and a folder of legal documents under her arm. The same workmen who had boarded up the windows were now removing the boards under Augustus's supervision, preparing the house for whatever use the family had planned. Augustus spotted them coming and straightened, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion as he took in James's appearance. "What in God's name—" "Hello, Uncle," James said pleasantly. "I'm sure this is quite a shock, but I'm afraid reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Augustus went pale, actually staggering backward as if he'd seen a ghost, which, Margaret realized, he essentially had. "James? But we were told—" "You were told what you wanted to hear," James replied calmly, "just like you told Margaret what you wanted her to believe about her inheritance. The difference is, I have documentation to back up my claims." Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Augustus, I'll be needing those keys back, along with anything else you've removed from my house." "Your house?" Augustus sputtered. "Don't be ridiculous. You have no legal—" "I have every legal right," Margaret interrupted, producing the documents James had obtained. "According to your father's will, the one that's actually legally binding, I inherited not just Henry's property, but his voting shares in all family enterprises, which means I now control 51% of everything that bears the Whitmore name." Augustus grabbed the papers with shaking hands, his face growing redder as he read. Behind him, the workmen had stopped their labor to watch the drama unfold. This is impossible," Augustus stammered. "These documents, they can't be legitimate." "They're entirely legitimate," James said cheerfully. "Filed with the county clerk 23 years ago, and never superseded by any subsequent legal action. I've had 3 different lawyers verify their authenticity." Margaret watched with grim satisfaction as Augustus's confident facade crumbled. "The keys, please. And I'll need an accounting of everything that was removed from the premises. You can't— I won't—" Augustus looked around desperately, as if searching for some escape from the trap that was closing around him. "You will," James said, his voice dropping to a tone that made Margaret shiver despite the morning warmth, "because the alternative is a very public legal battle in which Margaret and I reveal exactly how you've been managing family assets all these years. And I suspect that investigation wouldn't be limited to inheritance disputes." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Augustus looked between them, clearly calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. "This isn't over," he said finally, producing the keys with obvious reluctance. "Oh, but it is," Margaret replied, accepting the keys with a steady hand. "At least, this part is. What comes next depends entirely on how cooperative you decide to be going forward." As Augustus and his workmen retreated down the drive, Margaret and James stood on the porch of the house that was once again and had always legally been her home. "How do you feel?" James asked, watching the Whitmore wagon disappear around the bend. Margaret looked out over the herb garden she had planted, now overgrown but still alive beneath the autumn weeds. "I feel like I can breathe again," she said honestly. "For the first time since Henry died, I feel like I have some control over my own life." "And what do you want to do with that control?" Margaret considered the question as she unlocked the front door, her front door, with hands that no longer shook. "I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. I want to use whatever authority I now have to protect people who can't protect themselves." James nodded approvingly. "Henry chose well when he married you." "I chose well when I married him," Margaret corrected, "and apparently he chose well when he was born with a twin brother who believes in justice." Over the months that followed, Margaret and James worked together to transform not just the Whitmore family holdings, but their entire approach to business and community relations. Using her majority stake, Margaret implemented fair wage policies, improved working conditions, and established funds to help employees facing medical or family crises. James, meanwhile, used his knowledge of the family's past practices to root out corruption and restore properties that had been questionably acquired over the years. The investigation into Augustus's management revealed enough irregularities to keep lawyers busy for months and resulted in several criminal charges. But perhaps more importantly, Margaret and James discovered that their partnership extended beyond legal necessities. Working together daily, they found that they shared not just a physical resemblance to Henry, but many of his values and perspectives. James had Henry's passion for justice, tempered by years of hard experience. Margaret had Henry's compassion, strengthened by her own trials and losses. "We make a good team," James observed one evening, as they reviewed plans for a new school they were funding in the district. "We do," Margaret agreed, then looked up from her papers to study his face in the lamplight. "James, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Do you ever feel guilty about us working together so closely, given that I was married to your brother?" James was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I feel grateful," he said finally. "Grateful that Henry found someone who truly understood him, who shared his values and his dreams. And grateful that losing him didn't end your story. It just changed the direction." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I'll always love Henry. That won't change." "I wouldn't want it to," James replied. "But loving someone who's gone doesn't mean you can't also love someone who's here. At least, that's what I've come to believe." Margaret looked at this man who looked so much like her husband, but was unmistakably himself, scarred where Henry had been sheltered, cautious where Henry had been trusting, experienced in ways that Henry had never needed to be. Over the months of their partnership, she had come to know him not as Henry's replacement, but as James himself, and what she had discovered was a man worthy of love in his own right. "James," she said quietly, "what happened to Maria? After you left?" James's expression grew sad but peaceful. "She lived a good life, married a good man who treated her well, raised 3 children, who all made something of themselves. She died about 5 years ago. I heard about it when I was passing through New Mexico." He paused. "I'm glad she was happy. That's all I ever really wanted for her." Margaret reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "And what do you want for yourself?" James turned his hand palm up, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "I want to build something lasting, something that honors the brother I lost and the woman I found, something that proves love can survive anything, even death and separation and the worst that families can do to each other." Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes, but they were tears of hope rather than sorrow. "I think we're already building that." "Are we?" Margaret smiled, thinking of the school they were planning, the workers whose lives they were improving, the community they were helping to strengthen. But more than that, she thought of the partnership they had forged from shared loss and common purpose, the way they had transformed legal necessity into genuine affection and respect. "We are," she said with certainty, "every day, in every choice we make together." Their wedding took place 2 years after James had ridden into town, in the same church where Margaret had married Henry, but with a completely different understanding of what marriage could be. This wasn't the passionate rush of first love, but the steady commitment of 2 people who had learned that love came in many forms, and that partnership built on shared values could be just as strong as romance built on shared dreams. Pastor Williams, who had officiated at both ceremonies, spoke eloquently about the mysterious ways that loss could lead to unexpected blessings, and about the courage required to remain open to love, even after experiencing profound grief. As Margaret and James exchanged vows, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. Henry's death, the family's betrayal, James's arrival like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. She thought about the different kinds of love she had experienced, and how each had taught her something different about herself and what she was capable of giving and receiving. "What are you thinking about?" James asked as they danced at their small reception, held in the garden behind the house that was now truly their home. "I'm thinking about how many different ways there are to love someone," Margaret replied, "and how grateful I am to have learned more than one of them." James spun her around the makeshift dance floor, and Margaret laughed with genuine joy. Around them, their friends and neighbors celebrated, many of them employees whose lives had been improved by the changes Margaret and James had implemented. Others, simply townspeople who had watched their partnership grow from legal necessity into something beautiful and lasting. In the years that followed, Margaret and James continued their work of transforming the Whitmore legacy from one of exploitation to one of community service. They had 4 children together, 2 sons and 2 daughters, whom they raised to understand that privilege came with responsibility, and that true wealth was measured in the positive impact you had on other people's lives. Margaret never forgot Henry, but she learned that grief could coexist with happiness, that honoring one love didn't prevent the growth of another, and that sometimes the most unexpected paths led to the most rewarding destinations. She kept Henry's portrait in their parlor and told their children stories about their father's first love, making sure they understood that their family's foundation was built on multiple kinds of love, and that each was valuable in its own way. When Margaret died at the age of 71, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her work and James's. Former employees spoke of her fairness and compassion. Community leaders acknowledged the schools, hospitals, and charitable foundations she had helped establish. Business associates praised her integrity and vision, but the eulogy that captured her essence was delivered by her eldest daughter, who spoke of a woman who had faced the worst that life could offer and chosen to respond with grace rather than bitterness. "My mother taught us that love was not a finite resource," she said, looking out over the crowded church. "She showed us that it was possible to honor the past while embracing the future, to grieve honestly while remaining open to joy, and to transform personal loss into community gain." She paused, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "She proved that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the words, 'and then everything changed.' Her first marriage taught her about passionate love. Her trials taught her about her own strength. Her second marriage taught her about partnership and shared purpose. Each chapter of her life prepared her for the next, and each loss made room for unexpected blessings." James, now 75 but still strong and proud, sat in the front pew surrounded by their children and grandchildren, thinking about the day he had ridden into town looking for his brother's widow and found instead his own future. He thought about the ways that love could multiply rather than divide, how 2 people could honor the dead while building something new for the living. After the service, as the family gathered at the house that had seen so many changes over the years, James's youngest son asked him about the portrait of Henry that still hung in the parlor. "Do you ever feel strange," the boy asked, "living with a picture of mother's first husband?" James looked up at the portrait, painted shortly after Henry and Margaret's wedding, showing a young man with hope shining in his eyes and love radiating from his smile. "No," James said simply, "I feel grateful. That man loved your mother enough to help her become the woman I fell in love with. He taught her about partnership and shared dreams, about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Without him, she wouldn't have been ready for what we built together." He paused, thinking about the brother he had never really known but whose influence had shaped his entire adult life. "Besides," he added with a slight smile, "he looks like me. So it's a little like having my own portrait on the wall, honoring the man I might have been if I'd had his advantages and his optimism." The boy considered this, then nodded with the acceptance that children often bring to family complexities that confuse adults. That evening, as the house settled into quiet after the day's mourning and remembrance, James sat alone in the parlor beneath Henry's portrait and thought about the strange journey that had brought him from a supposedly dead cattle thief to the head of one of the most respected families in the territory. "Thank you," he said quietly to the painted face that looked so much like his own, "for loving her well enough that she could love again, for teaching her that marriage could be a partnership of equals, for leaving her with the strength to fight when they tried to take everything away. He paused, then added with a smile, "And thank you for having terrible relatives. Without them, I never would have had the chance to discover what an extraordinary woman you'd married." Outside, the wind moved through the trees that Margaret had planted over the years, rustling leaves that carried the sound of her laughter, her voice, her enduring presence in the home she had fought to keep and transformed into something beautiful. And in that sound, James heard the echo of all the different kinds of love that had shaped their lives, passionate and steady, first and second, lost and found, each one precious and necessary and perfectly imperfect in its own way.